As Iranian forces of Iran's 3rd Armored Brigade of their regular army had been fighting in the southern portions of downtown and the entire south of the city in general, since the invasion had officially kicked off at midnight and their forces had effectively rolled in, gotten into place, and had begun to use their intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance apparatus linked into the Sino-Russian real-world battlefield data processing AI system. As they were very surgical in their approach, they had, at least thus far, attempted to do very minimal damage to the portions of their area of operations as it pertained to their sub-AO within the larger area of operations, which included the entire Albuquerque area and surrounding regions within the 30-mile north-south by 15-mile east-west area. As the Iranian 3rd Armored Brigade was also responsible for rapidly capturing the Kirtland Air Force Base, as their 2 armored battalions committed to battle had smashed through the gates, pincered and pinched off a large grouping of Air Force defenders, everything from elite pararescue troops that were part of the Quick Reaction Forces, or QRF, as well as also the base security and even many other types of personnel, having had been surrounded, were also hit heavily by Chinese, predominantly, air attack from their JH-7 squadron, dropping the vast majority of their enormous payloads on the Kirtland Air Force Base, including also missile strikes from all 3 nations involved in this battle, which were Iran, China, and Pakistan, as the Pakistani 176 Missile Artillery Regiment had fired their medium-range Babur Alpha 1 cruise missiles, which were terrain-hugging and very accurate, to take out all the bridges up and down the river, minus the only remaining intact crossing, which was the I-40 bridge and 2 adjacent street bridges, which at 4 a.m. were heavily engaged in a battle with the last American combat elements of the 1st of the 200th. A single mechanized infantry company, along with some armed reactionary civilians, had attempted to engage the Pakistani combat engineers in battle, but were heavily annihilated as the last remaining 2 pairs of their Mirage 5 ground attack aircraft squadron, which was the number 8 squadron specifically of the Pakistani Air Force, as the number 8 squadron was configured to fire the Ra'ad standoff cruise missiles, which were utilized by these last pairs of aircraft, who also strafed the ground with their very powerful 30mm nose cannons, as well as a massive array of firepower from the ground-based forces of the combat engineers, who were equipped with a host of anti-tank and anti-armor weapons, everything from the Chinese Type 69 rocket-propelled grenades to the Spanish-made Al-Qatan, as well as also the HJ-08 anti-tank missiles, which were very highly capable and destructive weapons, as well as also artillery fire coming in from both battalions, shifting their fire on their respective sides of the river as it pertained to the Rio Grande, and the battalions on either side belonging to the 2 different brigades, which comprise the 18th ID overall, as they heavily shelled armed reactionary civilians who fled into the neighborhoods and the Petroglyph National Monument as it pertained to the neighborhoods immediately outside of the monument. Mechanized infantry forces had moved in pursuit after a massive artillery barrage had occurred in the northwest of the city. By this point, 65% of Albuquerque lay in total ruins, including even portions of downtown, which were decided upon to be struck by massive artillery fire from the Pakistani heavy guns of their M198 equipped 2 different artillery battalions, as all of their comprising firing batteries, 8 howitzers per, were equipped with these potent and very durable howitzers, which delivered the 155mm shells on target. And As a result of the heavy shelling and missile strikes from predominantly China and Pakistan, as Iranian IRGC missile forces of the 7th Al-Hadid Brigade primarily focused on the Kirtland Air Force Base and then would later focus on peripheral areas around the airport proper, as the missile strikes, including from cruise missiles coming from container-based systems having their targeting data updated, would have to be sanctioned by the overall command in charge of the entire operation, as the airport and its facilities were wanted as intact as was humanly possible, which essentially meant that Iranian and Pakistani forces fighting in downtown had to effectively fight somewhat with their hands tied behind their backs, and were not free to use all their heavy weapons everywhere there was resistance, only in certain areas. As due to the proximity of the international airport and installation itself to portions of downtown, including the highway junction of I-40 and 25, it was decided that in the Iranian zone, this would become the red zone for the future occupation and colonization efforts for this given area. And as many of the runways were still quasi-intact in the Air Force Base as well as left intact in the airport, these would be critical when it would come to logistical resupply operations and troop rotations for the future occupation forces. As the facilities would likewise need to be captured intact, the airmen that had fled early on into the airport proper, the international airport, or the Albuquerque Sunport as it's called, consisted of personnel that were already located there, which were drawn from the base security forces, as well as several hundred others who made it out alive and had gotten into the airport. All in all, there were by now 550 Air Force personnel defenders, and among their ranks were also pararescue soldiers, although the entire contingent was now a contingent of mixed forces, which also included base personnel for security, as well as other types of personnel that had been on the Kirtland Air Base at the time of the Iranian assault and airstrikes and missile strikes, as well as also artillery fire from their own artillery battalion firing their M109A1 155mm howitzers left over from the old Shah military forces, and now was in the service of the 3rd Armored Brigade of Iran. And these were also very capable howitzers, as they could deliver precision strikes that were ISR directed by the myriad of quadcopter assets that were also grafted into the real-time battlefield data processing artificial intelligence system of the Chinese and Russians, the coalition leadership, as well as also the high-altitude drones and even satellite overlays, which gave a full real-time view of the modern evolving battlefield through the combat data links, which the Iranians possessed in every single solitary vehicle, although they did not have the PDA versions carried by dismounted NCOs of the Chinese and Russian forces. They at least had them in their vehicles. And the Pakistanis, although they were going through their military overhaul, did not possess them in every vehicle type, although some were being installed in certain types of vehicles during this overhaul process, and they had not fully integrated drones into their military doctrine, although they were working on that as China was supplying them, at least with company-level quadcopter reconnaissance assets, as platoon and squad levels would have to be retrained, which would take a massive effort to be able to utilize these systems effectively, as the Pakistanis are also having their military industry upgraded at the same time. Their joining the coalition was not only because they were a firmly committed Chinese longtime, but also because they developed the nation, its infrastructure, and its military, including its military industries. As now, the Iranian armored forces were effectively, at this point in time, controlling massive swathes of the downtown of the city. They had bottled up armed reactionary civilians in 2 main pockets, and were now fighting to clear these pockets in order to clear the flanks for their final assault, which would occur against the airport facilities proper. And that would be a very cautiously planned and undertaken operation, as again, they had to move surgically to take the facilities intact, and that had been the only reason why all the airmen had not been completely destroyed as of this point in time. They were not hit with heavy artillery unless they emerged from the airport structures and surrounding structures, or by loitering munitions if they did so, or also by air power. But for the time being, the last of the coalition aircraft by 5 a.m. were leaving the battlefield as the Mirage 5 squadron had jettisoned its payloads in the western end of the city as they had fired their Ra'ad cruise missiles at the last of the mechanized infantry forces of the Americans of their first of the 200th, as again the battalion had been split up between Albuquerque and Santa Fe, and the rest of the battalion in the north had been annihilated or taken captive within the first 2 hours by the massive Russian 8th Combined Arms Army. As now, these forces, completely wiped out, only left the support platoon that was here to support the 2 mechanized infantry companies, and by extension, the Alpha Company of the 2nd of the 198th that had been sent in to conduct interoperability training with the mechanized infantry forces just prior to the invasion's kickoff. As the invasion came as a complete surprise, they ended up fighting within the city, and although they fought valiantly, were ultimately destroyed as the Pakistani forces in the battle that occurred in the area of their pontoon bridge, their PB-79A in Rio Rancho in northern Albuquerque, had effectively annihilated a mechanized infantry battalion and Alpha Company, the Mech Infantry Battalion, the other one of 2, which was part of the first of the 200th. As in this area, the combat engineers in their various tactical formations, rolling T's, wedge formations, double column, like this one going in this hotel building with a squad already on the roof, this one stacking and going around the corner cautiously with vehicle moving up to provide them support, rolling T going into this building, which already has a squad on the roof, and this squad moving up to get into another wedge to assist this wedge in holding off armed reactionary civilian elements who were moving down the street at the time, and carefully coordinating all their firepower with the incoming armored forces of the armored battalion moving into the area to cut off the fleeing armed reactionary civilians who were fleeing the artillery barrage and the advancing mechanized infantry, as they had committed effectively 4 of their 8 companies to this specific AO, this area of operations within the scope of this larger battle in this 1.5 by 1.5 mile area. They had moved in with heavy artillery support. Even the last PLAAF fighter aircraft, which loaded down with very limited air-to-ground munitions, as it was predominantly armed with air-to-air munitions, had dropped 4 of its precision-guided 1,000-pound munitions on this grouping of armed reactionary civilians, as precision ISR-guided artillery strikes and tank shells, as well as fire coming in from the IFVs of the Viper IFVs, as well as the heavy machine guns on the Talhas, as well as the tanks, besides their 125mm shells, had hurriedly annihilated these forces, leaving the last remaining 2 armored infantry battalions and tank battalion, as well as the headquarters and support battalion, to move through the area and mop up as these other companies had moved ahead. They would fall in behind them. As the combat engineers now firmly held control over the area, they had been the ones who had actually ended up finishing off the last of the American mechanized infantry forces with their very heavy firepower from their Al-Fad IFVs with their monstrous 40mm autocannon, as well as their dismount anti-armor weapons, anti-tank weapons. And now, in the downtown area, within this 2-mile by 1 mile area, 2 miles north-south, 1 mile east-west, this battle opens up exactly at 5 a.m. and is the final hour of the fighting to capture the city and ultimately clear the red zone, or effectively clear the flanks, of all armed resistance before a logistical resupply a time period for logistical resupply was set to occur before the final assault would be planned to go into the international airport. As the actual Sunport Boulevard was a bit further south and off this map, it led directly into the airport premises, and on the periphery of the airport premises was all of these standard corporate entities with warehouse buildings and the like, as they utilize the airport facilities for parcel shipping, as well as also your standard shipping type companies that people purchased goods from also had locations here. And as Americans sent out small reconnaissance parties as they lacked ISR capabilities due to the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes, as well as the electronic warfare, at least for a time, until the JH-7s, equipped with the very powerful KG-600 electromagnetic targeted jamming pods, had left the area to do an RTB because they had to rearm, refuel, and do any needed maintenance to get the aircraft airworthy again for their next sortie. As two pairs, at least over this one specific area, of the Pakistani JF-17B fighter squadron were now en route to do their RTB to Mexico and were the last of the coalition aircraft to leave the battle space as the J-10s of the PLAAF squadron of J-10s, as well as the JH-7s with their electronic warfare capabilities, which blanketed the area with the EW jamming on the American portable radar sets, which there were a few within Kirtland, as well as, of course, the standard radars that one would expect to find on an air installation. Even the civil radars found in the airport, all was jammed by the JH-7s, which denied America even that as a form of ISR capabilities. It also made any weapons dependent upon signals, which were essentially tied to electronics, to be jammed as well, as these aircraft had already done their RTB back to Mexico, including the Mirage 5 squadron, after jettisoning their last payloads against the American ground forces of the Army National Guard. The JF-17Bs were now leaving the area, and they, as well, had expended their limited numbers of air-to-ground munitions in other areas. As again, besides the major combat areas, there were times where armed reactionary elements would be spotted moving in certain areas, and they would be quickly dealt with by airstrikes or even loitering munition strikes, as loitering munitions scoured the battlefield and were in high demand as it pertained to the Iranian Shahed 238. And as there is ample numbers of activity occurring throughout this entire battle space, this 2-mile by 1-mile area, which comprises the northern areas of downtown, the southern areas of downtown moving north, as well as neighborhoods that extend further into the south city and suburban areas technically outside of city limits. As the Iranian forces had surrounded a relatively large grouping of armed reactionary civilians that were unprepared, and all they had was their personal weapons, as again, the invasion began at midnight, many were asleep, and those that were out traveling that were unarmed were away from their weapons as this all began. Many people were caught off guard and were totally unprepared and were slaughtered as a result if they tried to suddenly cluster together and put up resistance, as was being done throughout the entire battlefield itself. As in this area, the Pakistani howitzers were now firing precision artillery fire, heavily ISR guided, as again, this was an absolutely vital area, and as the Pakistani armor had already moved rapidly into the city, and by rapidly, that involved even herding armed reactionary elements into this area and stopping to engage others en route, as there were smaller numbers than the icon, as the icon signifies near 200 or larger. There was a smaller element to the north of I-40 in this battlefield on either side of I-25, numbering less than 100 on each side. As these forces had escaped the earlier pincers, 2 Pakistani tank companies here and 2 moving here, with the 3 armored infantry companies moving to mop up after a heavy artillery saturation of this part of downtown, would move in and seize control rapidly of the area and mop up any potential survivors, which, though unlikely as it would be, was still possible, as strange things sometimes occur in warfare and people survive in incredible ways, and the Pakistani forces would be very thorough in clearing or capturing any combatants that still somehow remained alive at this point. As artillery also hit the other side, this mauve color coding of the rail system is civilian rail. It's Amtrak's rail runner system that goes through downtown to the train station, as the brown color-coded rail system is freight rail. And As it pertained to this area in downtown, Pakistani and Iranian forces were working together to an extent as these forces took cover behind these tanks. These were armored infantry troops taking cover as well as being dismounted from different vehicles going into this building. This squad was already on the roof, engaging these American forces on the roof. This whole area was the University of New Mexico campus, and this particular area here was effectively a walled-in pedestrian area with different buildings related to the university, as this building would be completely annihilated by tank shell fire, the smaller building right here. These larger buildings would be assaulted by armored infantry troops, as the armored forces, some firing nearly point blank into the buildings themselves, as this one company's combat elements have surrounded this area, cutting off the last remaining armed reactionary civilians of what earlier was a slightly bigger pocket, as it took some time to go thoroughly and methodically through all of these buildings, clearing them of armed reactionary elements. As to clear all of these buildings, it took roughly about an hour, and now the movements to cut off and surround what remained was now in its terminal phase, as now at 5 a.m., where this map opens, these are the last remaining elements within these buildings and outside of them taking cover around this short walled-in area. As they were firing over this brick and concrete wall, tank shells were being returned, frag T shells mostly, in order to do as much minimal damage to the buildings as possible, although it wasn't always possible, as this building was completely annihilated with everybody inside. There were armed reactionary civilians on the roofs of these buildings, and many that were outside in this courtyard and that were fighting back. There was a manhole cover that had been discovered in this area. It had been removed, and eventually any surviving armed reactionary elements would try to flee. Others would move out the other way, trying to flee into this area, and would be cut down by a hail of different fire from the lead tank, as the Karar main battle tank not only had a remote control heavy machine gun weapons station, but also had slots to install 2 machine guns on each and every hatch, as there were 2 hatches and each could have a machine gun. And they also had their coax machine gun alongside of their main weapon, the 125mm gun. As all this fire was immense, just even from the machine gun fire alone, the lead tank had 4 different options for machine gun fire and simply cut all of these personnel down. The vector, angle, and traverse of fire was always precise because they cut down on friendly fire through the AI data processing system, which advised them on what weapons to utilize. Hence, they were not going to use a shell on these personnel, as tanks of another company had surrounded this area. These were the headquarters vehicles for this company as well as this armored infantry company, with the other 4 tanks that belonged to this tank company that were part of the headquarters platoon further south off map, providing security. As this company was moving into the area, they effectively were assisting in securing just this entire area in general, as the interchange was very important. And there were even armed reactionary civilians and technicals trying to flee down the highways, meandering and weaving and bobbing through all of the abandoned vehicles and getting destroyed, at least where the highway was on the ground level, by vehicle-based fire, and where it was elevated, loitering munition strikes, and even other types of strikes were available to get vehicles that were on these stilted highway areas that were held up by support columns and whatnot. But the highway, again, was absolutely crucial to the doctrine being practiced, as 4th-generation warfare yet again involves Trojan shock armies doing much of the heavy lifting, taking the lead role in the invasion as they would emerge from their properties, their CCP regime properties, rapidly seize control of their objectives before the enemy or target nation even knew what hit it. And the routes were simply for the moving in of external components and then future logistical resupply from neighboring nations. As the highways were a critical component of this, they were absolutely vital in the sense of maintaining the occupation after the invasion had been won. But for the time being, the primary goal for controlling key nodes like cities and towns along major highways was to secure the highway infrastructure to make it easy for the rapid, heavy-handed reinforcements to move in from both Canada and Mexico and move deep into the country and fan out and effectively reinforce or even replace Trojan shock units, as in move into an area to free up Trojan shock forces to do other tasks, as was being done as it pertained to Houston, freeing up the 83rd PLA Group Army to move into northeast Texas, southeast Oklahoma, and southwest Arkansas and northwest Louisiana as their new area of operations. As in this case, the smallest invasion prong, at least in the south-central invasion sector, was the invasion prong moving up through New Mexico, which was the 14th PLA Group Army and the 18th PAP Brigade, or Light Armored Brigade, which would be shed in the Albuquerque area to assist in the counterinsurgency operations and occupation operations, along with the Trojan shock forces already here. They would reinforce them with this powerful paramilitary element who specialized in crushing insurgents, as they had ample years of experience in this anytime they had arose in Xinjiang when certain bad actors brought in weapons, at least to the Chinese, and smuggled them across the border and started issues there. They were brutally suppressed each and every time by the PAP. And now the PAP would be 10 times worse when occupying this nation, as early on, well in excess of 1,000 armed civilians that were not reactionary and didn't dare fight back right away when they knew they weren't organized, they knew they had not the adequate weaponry to challenge these forces. They fled into the mountains, as many Americans held on to the fantasy that just because Americans were heavily armed, it meant that they could fend off an invasion, which was absolutely not true. The population had to be well trained, they had to be in shape, they had to understand the realities of high-intensity warfare, which they did not. This was a very war-naive population, and even the veterans of the previous two wars, though they had some combat experience, true enough, what was going on in this war made that pale by comparison. And even they were not even fully ready for this, but they were in a better way than most people and would perform better than most people. But that still didn't negate the fact that the invaders were succeeding and doing so rapidly with a total, complete, surprise, shock and awe invasion nationwide. As now the loitering munition strikes had hit their targets as well, as Shahed 238 slammed into groupings of dismounts and technicals, which were the civilian vehicles that people fought from. Not all that dissimilar from this image here, where a platoon is rolling down the street led by its infantry fighting vehicle, effectively its BMP-3 of the armored infantry troops. This BMP-3 is firing its 30mm autocannon and some of the shells from it being ejected. It destroyed this technical. This one's just gotten blasted into pieces. Shrapnel and debris from it flew through the windshield and got this guy. Now this guy's stranded in the back and he's still firing, but about to get hit by an RPG fired from one of the soldiers in a double column rolling shield formation, where the squad tactically breaks up into two half squads following behind their vehicle, which is their rolling shield, and they get ever nearer to their enemies as they close on their enemies tactically. And the heavy firepower on the vehicle, like the 30mm autocannon at 7.62 coax, these are the smoke dischargers, this is the driver hatch. And this is a Concours ATGM, as they had 4 Concours ATGMs on each BMP-2, which were very destructive anti-tank missiles. This truck is leaving tire marks as it's essentially, for lack of a better term to call it, hauling ass and trying to get out of here, as these 3 technicals had rolled down this street, stopped, and tried to lay down fire, but failed as the rounds just bounce off and do nothing. As these personnel are crossing the street, this point man of this squad, remember, they have their vehicles behind them of their Barak APCs, which have the heavy 12.7mm machine guns, and they have their weapons staggered in each direction to support their dismounts, and they're firing at the top floors as this man is doing a spray and pray, holding up his AR-15 and pulling the trigger as fast as he can, but it's doing nothing because he's not aiming and is probably, if anything, hitting the APCs, and if he's even doing that, it's not doing any damage whatsoever at all, while the APC is firing their heavy machine gun from their machine gun turret, and it's cutting through this concrete wall like a hot knife through butter, smacking into the rooms inside. Other squad members following the point man, who's slightly around the corner, although this guy gets a lucky hit, hits him in his vest, which is going to give him sore ribs but do nothing else, as he points his PKM general purpose machine gun with its image intensifying red dot sight optics, firing the 7.62 by 54 millimeter round from the drum of belted ammunition. This is the carrying handle and barrel changing handle, firing it and cutting these personnel down as these others are about to get hit by it. And these guys found enemies in these rooms. This guy popped out from around a corner and got popped in the head immediately as a grenade is being thrown into each floor by the other squad members following behind. These personnel, they're having a little muzzle climb as they have their KLS, or their effectively their Chinese Type 56 AKM clones, effectively a version of the AKM. And they're firing them in full automatic. They got a guy in this room and another one that's behind this corner, and rifles are climbing a bit as they fire out a bunch of rounds. On the roof here, there's a wounded Iranian soldier here who got hit, and these guys are providing covering fire so the combat medics can come and pull him out and work on him. And he got hit in the shoulder. They're wearing body armor, only really a headshot or an extremities shot that causes them to bleed out is the only way really to effectively cut these guys down, unless it's a civilian with a Barrett 50 cal or a Lapua or something like that, but that's unlikely. This guy's firing his PKM, as is this point man here. He's firing his up at these personnel on the roof. Many of them are getting hit, body shots, head shots. Some are dropping their rifles over the edge of the building because they were firing over it. These loitering munitions are about to come down and get these guys on the roof. One already slammed down into this building and blasted glass and debris out of the top 2 floors because the HE munition was that powerful. It destroyed the top 2 floors. There's a guy in here where there's muzzle flash, and they're exchanging fire back and forth from this squad on the roof. Not all that dissimilar from what was going on here as they engaged each other in a line formation as they emerged onto the roof before reorienting their fire to cover their other men on the ground. As tanks fired into these buildings, tactically they cleared away with frag T shells for these personnel to rapidly, like shock forces, just race into the building as fast as they could and begin to clear it. As the exchange of fire on the roof, as well as a loitering munition strike, would eliminate these personnel, another loitering munition strike would come in and get these personnel who were trying to heave Molotovs over the edge of the building, but were just out of range to really get a good hit on the tank, and they were getting return fire, at least from the tank turret weapons station, from the automatic turret, or remote-controlled turret, rather, as the gunner inside could remote control this. He was firing it back up at these personnel. And as that was going on, fire, of course, was being traded between this squad and a wedge formation of armored infantry. It's the armored infantry have dismounted to mutually support their armor, and they're doing so effectively as they go in and raid this building with one squad here, these 2 squads, and this squad, as these are 2 different squads. This wedge formation is here, and this squad wrapped around the tank is going in with these 2 squads. So 3 squads go in this way, 1 squad goes in this way, and 2 squads go into this building. And as they begin to raid it, and the tank's firepower becomes far too heavy, and these personnel begin to perish as they try to flee in different areas. At the opening of the map, these got cut down as they were fleeing this building, as this squad was going in to clear it. And these vehicles are moving up. And they would get Molotov hits as personnel would run out like kamikaze Molotov men and throw Molotovs onto these vehicles, these 2 Barak APCs, and they actually caught fire and had to be abandoned, but the other 2 continued down to effectively support their infantry, mutually support their dismounts. As that was going on at these interchanges, loitering munition strikes, vehicle-based fire powers, as this part was elevated of I-25 and this was not, they fired and destroyed these vehicles on the interstate here. as the technicals were trying to again move through all these vehicles. The interstate is not a safe place to be during this type of invasion, of course, as it's highly guarded, as it was the main objective. As the loitering munition strikes came in and destroyed these vehicles with the wedge formations of dismounts firing RPGs and their small arms, they're destroying all of these technicals. Artillery came in and cut these 2 personnel down at the beginning and destroyed this vehicle, while Iranian fire was coming in at the same time, cutting these personnel down. As these personnel were running through the area effectively at the same time as the Pakistanis were moving through, artillery fire had been very precise. Even the fire that landed here and finished off this building before the tanks got to the end was precise, as were these. All of it ISR directed onto these forces. One here, one here, one here, as well as others on these buildings here, and even here behind this blast right here. There's one right there, another one right there, one right there, and one right there. All these blasts came in and finished off most of these personnel, except for some that were really well positioned in rubble, like 2 right here who fired at the tanks as they were coming in and got heavy return fire by the tank turret gunners who cut them down as they exposed themselves. As the tanks were also firing over here as well across this street level portion of highway. They were firing heavy machine gun ammunition and coax ammunition and cut these personnel down immediately, and the loitering munition strikes got more personnel on and off map slightly. Another one came in and got these personnel at the opening. One came in and got these on the roof. Another came in and got these here. Artillery strikes were coming in and more that got all these personnel here, and the support platoon that emerged from temporary hiding within the well-protected parking garage areas, as most military personnel understood that the strongest civil structures were the parking garages that were multi-floor. As again, parking garages were designed as extremely thick steel-reinforced concrete multi-floor structures that had so much rebar and layers of concrete as they were meant to hold many tens of thousands of tons worth of vehicles at a time, if necessary, as that's what they were engineered and designed to be. These were outstanding places if the vehicles could clear the entryway to get them into, if the vehicles were low profile enough. And many were. And they got into the nearest parking garage that was north of the rail line here, and they had emerged, and they were spotted by the high altitude and company level quadcopter assets of Pakistani forces moving into the area, and heavy artillery strikes came in and finished them off. They got their armored supply vehicles, which are M113s, that were utilized to carry ammunition, plastic fuel containers of fuel, food, water, everything needed to the mechanized infantry forces, and by extension also Alpha Company, as they were also at their original bivouac sites that were hit by missiles and artillery. They had tank shells, they had all kinds of other ammunition, including for the Bradley, 20mm ammunition for the Bradley, tow missiles. They had all that stuff at their bivouac sites when the Chinese, Pakistani missiles and Pakistani artillery had come in and destroyed it with, again, the Iranian missiles, the Shahab-2s fired by the IRGC 7th Al-Hadid Missile Brigade, which the IRGC was Iranian paramilitary forces, as they had different branches of their paramilitary, in some ways similar to China having different paramilitary branches. But they hit this area with their Shahab-2 tactical ballistic missiles, as well as Chinese tactical ballistic and cruise missiles hitting here, and also Pakistani, but the Pakistanis and Chinese were primarily responsible for the bivouac sites along with the artillery strikes, and the Chinese spent most of their air-based strikes on the Kirtland Air Force Base in direct support of the Iranian assault, which was enormous, as the JH-7s, each one alone, can carry almost exactly 20,000 pounds of ordnance, which is enormous for a ground attack aircraft. That's over twice what the Mirage 5 can carry, and the Mirage 5 is still a relatively good ground attack aircraft. These forces were running through the area. Tank shells of the Frag T variety came in and started blasting them as they started getting to this area and concentrating. The shells came in and wiped them out, as also shells continue to fly further as they could vector shells in along with the artillery fire. It was hellishly destructive. Some ran the entire gauntlet of fire and made it into this parking garage. They would end up surrendering later. But for now, loitering munitions hit this truck, this technical that was in the parking lot of this building right here. It had a small parking area. These personnel were cut down by this wedge formation and their Barak APC firing heavy machine gun fire. These paramilitary local SWAT vehicles, MRAPs that had light machine guns, the local SWAT elements, including right here and here, were all destroyed by a combination of Iranian firepower as well as Pakistani firepower from their tanks. As their lead tank got here, they fired a shell directly into this one and destroyed it, a heat shell, a standard heat shell, and blasted it to pieces. They could have even just used an HE shell, and that would have done the job. But they basically, the tanks following behind, cut these personnel down as they fled from the building. Again, loitering munition. These personnel at the opening, as they were fleeing, the tanks fired at them with heavy machine gun fire. The rest tried to run down here, but were cut off by Iranian vehicle-based fires and destroyed. All of this was savage and hellish. I mean, it was insanely destructive. As the Iranian forces moved through this building here, their last two vehicles, as the others burned, they would have to recover those later. As these forces came through, the squads and vehicles that were protecting the rear flanks of these vehicles were firing on these personnel, cutting them down as the squad breached the building at the opening. Again, there's so many things occurring all at once, showing them in order is very difficult, but it's being attempted. As over in this area, as again, this area had fallen after these forces had entered, after the tanks had for some time worn the area down and the rest of the personnel had fled into the sewers in the University of New Mexico campus area here. To the east is the VA hospital and other hospitals, like I think the University of New Mexico hospital is in that area, as well as other neighborhoods. And a tactical ballistic missile was sanctioned to be used by the Al-Hadid Brigade, the 7th Al-Hadid. They fired one into this warehouse building. Again, buildings on the periphery of the airport proper were sometimes allowed to be destroyed as the American pararescue troops, as well as others in their mixed unit forces, had moved into the area to conduct active recon, where they were actually fighting, but also trying to figure out what the hell was even going on in the rest of the area. So they destroyed the last two tanks that would be destroyed in this campaign as it pertained to the Iranian Karar tanks, as they again had lost already 7 of these tanks while taking the Kirtland Air Force Base to the pararescue men who had special weapons like anti-tank weapons, as they were allowed to utilize those in that area due to Kirtland being the nation's largest nuclear weapons storage and maintenance facility beneath the base itself. As the surface of the base was completely in total ruins, the underneath, the underworld of the base effectively was what was taken by the Iranian forces, and they would send in specialized crews later to recover their buried treasure, proverbially speaking, as it was a treasure, as it boosted their nation's position instantaneously, as they had live nuclear weapons and materials, as well as other associated and correlating documents and schematics, which boosted their nuclear weapons program in a phenomenal way, and also giving them a real nuclear deterrent, automatically boosting their position in the Middle East and in the world. As these were container-based Club Ks, or caliber missiles, fired from one of the Russian container-based systems, as there also were the Chinese YJ-18Cs, as Russia and China got thousands of these systems into the country, 10,000, which would equal 40,000 of these missiles, which would fire in different salvos. The salvo that was fired at 5 a.m. had been redirected only with 2 of the 4 missiles of one container being sent into this area, hitting other buildings behind where this Shahab 2 was striking, along with the Iranian artillery strikes that were sanctioned for this area to hit all the American airmen that had left the relative safety, at least for the time, of the international airport grounds and structures, as they had moved to this area on the outer periphery into these warehouse buildings. Before the artillery fire had struck and the Shahab struck, what had occurred right before was one of the garage doors was effectively open to the loading dock in this warehouse. They fired out a few javelins and a few tow missiles at these tanks with a tow missile hitting this tank, but failing as the tank's turret was turned. It ended up hitting the top of the ERA plating, and the tank was still going. Effectively, it was not destroyed, so they had fired a javelin again on top of it, top attack mode, which hit it on its vulnerable roof area, destroying the tank and wiping out the crew. This tank, they fired a few javelins at. Two of the lead men of this column had both decided to fire at the same tank. They fired two javelins on top attack mode at this tank. The tank did not have the same features as the Chinese tanks with the IR or laser scrambling, so the top attack mode worked and destroyed this tank. But as a result, enormous firepower was vectored into these forces, as was artillery that was ISR guided, directed for precision strikes. The Shahab-2 came in and struck right as these tanks were destroyed. And an artillery strike on this remnants of this building right here, which was heavily damaged from tank shells at the opening. This was a larger building, but it was crumbled on one side with the roof pancaking due to all the tank shell fire, and many had been KIA'd, and others were trying to flee when the artillery shell came in and decimated the building. Tank shells destroyed these forces and these forces, as also tank shells were being fired into the building at the same time, as well as heavy machine gun fire. With the artillery and Shahab-2 strike, even the cruise missiles behind this area hitting another building. It was essentially a large kill box. It was sanctioned to be destroyed, as the airmen had to be dealt with, as even though they were doing active reconnaissance trying to figure out what was going on in the city, they had failed in their task and had been utterly annihilated by all the different firepower that was vectored against them, as the Iranian artillery was again directed by the constellation of reconnaissance assets and precision fired as a result, and destroyed these forces along with all the tank-based fires, Shahab-2 strikes, and even the cruise missile strikes further in depth into the area, destroying another building where others were taking refuge, as the high-altitude assets and platoon level for the Iranians, quadcopter assets, had seen them as well, and they were destroyed. Anything that can be seen on the modern battlefield can absolutely be annihilated on the modern battlefield. And as all of that was going on and these forces were cut down and the squad was working through clearing this building, tanks were firing at these forces here with heavy machine gun fire, cutting them down, clearing the flanks for the assault of these two platoons moving in along with their dismounted squads, who were cutting down these American forces with the aid of the vehicle-based firepower and these squads that were guarding the rear flanks, cutting all these personnel down early on in the fighting. As these two squads were peeling around this large building right here, three of them had been KIA'd, three Iranian troops right off the bat as they were storming this area with their vehicles moving down the center. They had lost three troops over here as well, and they, from these two squads here that were moving in to clear these buildings, and they did get into the buildings. This squad tried to flee at the time, but was cut down as the Iranian armored infantry were moving into this area as well, and were firing enormous firepower vectored at this direction at all of these forces and destroying the technical, cutting these personnel down as they were trying to get into this building, because they were trying to go through a door that was right here. And they were all cut down by the hail of fire. These personnel survived, although they were being engaged as they ran over here, but then eventually they as well were cut down. They did not make it. As the Iranian forces went through and clearing these buildings, they would move out and begin to clear this building and then take a position on the roof, because as this squad would move in and clear this building, these personnel had all been cut down by vehicle-based fires coming down this way, as these surviving vehicles moved here and vectored their fire in this direction to support their troops clearing the building, as the tanks also vectored fire into this area as well. They even shelled this building with Frag T shells before the other squad moved into it, because they had taken a bit of fire from the second floor, so they sent a shell into the second floor and Frag T and wiped out the resistance. As that happened, the vehicles of the Iranian armored infantry had dismounted a squad into this area, as these forces had all been cut down. These armed forces had all been cut right here by a combination of vehicles fires coming from this direction, and the dismounted fires, and an L vector of fire before these squads even moved in as well and began to engage these forces as they moved into these yards. That was after all these personnel had been wiped out, and then this squad would remain and hold their position right here. As these forces moved into this area, loitering munition strikes came in. These forces were cut down as they were fleeing from this squad moving in that already cut these personnel down. With the aid of vehicle-based fire vectored in, they ran. The loitering munition strike came in and got these personnel, these two loitering munitions striking here and here, getting these personnel as well. And the squad again finished off these personnel. So effectively, loitering munitions were doing a lot of work in this area, and the tanks were assisting in their area as well. One tank would even be effectively Molotoved at the opening, but it would be salvageable because its fire extinguishing system would end up working, but the crew bailed just for protocol, for procedures, because it started to get a bit bad inside of the tank with the flaming liquids. But fortunately for this tank, those who made these Molotovs did not put additional agents in that would continue burning for a lengthy amount of time, and the fire extinguishing system was potent enough to put it out effectively. So they would leave this tank here, but it would be salvageable. They would recover it and fix it. It was not a total loss like these tanks over here were. So they left the tank. They would leave it sit there as these other tanks would lay down enormous firepower with frag T shells, destroying all these houses and everybody around them with heavy machine gun fire as well. All the angle and traverse of weapons was all highly precise as dismounted armored infantry moved under the highway down these streets to get behind these tanks and assist them in their operations of vectoring fire. Mutual support tactically between infantry and armor as the troops would stack behind the tanks to provide their support out from behind the armor, similar to what occurred here as this squad that dismounted from their vehicle with leaving the driver and the gunner inside would, in two half squads, one member would step out and fire an RPG at this technical. Well, effectively, they were doing similar with these tanks. Now they were using them as a shield. They were stepping out and firing out from behind the cover of the tanks, just mowing these forces down. They had their platoon-level quadcopter assets monitoring everything in the area, which assisted in guiding in loitering munition strikes, which were devastating on these personnel. As other personnel were moving in, they were effectively doing what is called a hammer and anvil maneuver, as the armor was the anvil force ultimately, and then the hammer force was the armored infantry moving into the area. Effectively to the south of here, they had moved in and cut off this last pocket. As the pocket began a bit larger, but by the time it ended, it was about this large in just this area. This neighborhood had been sealed off, and very few people, such as these people around these houses, made it out alive. They all got into the sewers, even as they were being engaged. Some would be lost and KIA'd, but most would make it in. As this arrow's surrounded in a lot of purple, but it's not completely surrounded, which means that there were survivors. But those trying to get in here had all been wiped out by loitering munition strikes, as these Shahed 238s were very potent weapons indeed. And of course there's the fire coming from the vehicles and troops holding their position here before these troops moved in and vectored fire in this direction. Again, angle and traverse of fire, vectoring of fire, was all guided by the Sino-Russian AI system and the ISR network tied into it of the entire apparatus of surveillance drones, satellites, as well as also even the lowest level of drones, and even aircraft in certain areas, and of course radar tied into it all as well. But for the purposes of just the actions in this area, it was all related to the platoon level quadcopter assets, which moved throughout the area and were nearly ubiquitous and watched everything from rooftops all the way down to the street level. As these personnel are being wiped out, all their weapons are dropping, they're taking shots in the head. All this was directed by ISR capabilities. The radio within the vehicles, as the people monitored and within the vehicles, the drivers and gunners and even NCOs and officers in certain vehicles, as they monitored and commanded the operations through watching the real-time feed on their combat data links, they would radio their instructions to their NCOs who wore their radio headsets. And in turn, the dismounted squads would still be ISR directed. The Pakistanis did it to a similar extent, although they were not as well off in the combat data link domain as were the Iranians, who had theirs in every vehicle, which they still had to use dispatch techniques, as the officers and NCOs had to effectively radio commands over their radios to their troops that were dismounted, but still, having one in every vehicle very much simplified this process. And although the Iranians, at the company level at least, all had combat data links, and they did in some vehicle types at least, they too utilized radio as a form of dispatch for their dismounts, as well as vehicles in the field that did not possess any combat data links, whereas the Chinese and Russians had combat data links in every vehicle, and even every dismounted NCO and or officer possessed a PDA version of their combat data link. The soldier here just fired an RPG, which blasted into this building, which is all the smoke. That's all the debris from its impact. It's backblast from it. It's another rocket ready to be loaded, as his KLS, or his Iranian AK, effectively modeled off the Chinese Type 56 version of the AKM, slung on his back. This was all directed by these quadcopter ISR assets that were all throughout the battlefield, that also linked into the AI, which also helped with the targeting of these drones, because the Sino-Russian AI assets were a prominent fixture in the conduct of the whole operation. As again, AI revolutionized warfare to an extent that most people don't even understand. Many people think of warfare in antiquated terms, and it is nothing like that. And many nations were even developing their own AI capabilities. And although Iran was a fledgling nation in developing AI, China was the world leader in AI, and Russia not far behind, so they had capabilities that no other nations possessed. And when grafting in smaller allies like Iran and Pakistan and Belarus and even North Korea, as North Korea was going through its own military overhaul in some ways, these nations at least possessed the basics that could be grafted into this system, such as basic rudimentary combat data links, as well as ISR assets such as quadcopters or higher altitude drones, which could all be linked in to the Sino-Russian AI real-time battlefield data processing system. And the Iranian forces had effectively achieved their victory in the major flank clearance operations, as they had cleared the flanks for their main and final operation to capture the entire city, which would be the capture of the Sunport, or International Airport, which will be in the next 2 videos, with one more battle following, which would be hours later, and that would be a militia-type force in the south attempting to attack a CCP regime property, but would fail miserably for many reasons.